Hello and welcome to Starbound's second channel. My name is Gabriel the Bibi Capaldi and I'll be your narrator today. But before we get into today's story, please do check down below that you are subscribed to the channel. It's 100% free and helps us pop up on your feed a bit more often. Beside Ziziri stood a human cadet, Emma, if she remembered the name correctly from the enrollment lists. Iziri turned her head slightly, careful not to break formation, and took in the human woman's features. Unlike most of the other cadets who shifted nervously as the minutes ticked by, Emma stood with impeccable posture, spine straight, shoulders back, chin lifted with quiet confidence. But it wasn't her disciplined stance that made Aziri's inner eyelids blink with concern. The human possessed exactly the features that General Drozir was notoriously known for enjoying. Wide, curved hips that even the standard-issue uniform couldn't disguise. Hair that fell in soft waves just past her shoulders despite regulations, and most concerning of all, a battle scar. The jagged mark stretched from her left temple, curved around her eye, and ended at her jaw. A roadmap of past violence etched into otherwise smooth skin. The inspection hall of the main training facility was filled with the nervous energy of 200 new cadets from 37 species. They stood in perfectly aligned rows, segregated by assigned genders, females on the left, males on the right, waiting for their first inspection by the Galactic Council's Interspecies Military Command. Light streamed through the high windows, showing many dust particles that danced in the still air, occasionally glinting off metal fixtures or the more reflective skin and exoskeletons of certain species. Aziri straightened her own posture, trying not to fidget with the edges of her uniform. Like most Ivians, she stood slightly taller than the average human, with sleek limbs and rose-pink skin that was quite unusual for most species. Her most distinctive features, two small fangs that protruded slightly from her upper lip, were a source of both pride and self-consciousness. Her concern for the human only existed because she had heard about General Drozir long before she'd ever set foot in this training facility. The warnings had been passed from veteran to cadets during the rare moments when superior officers weren't listening. "Watch out for the Zodar General," they'd say. "He has wandering hands and a taste for the exotic." At first, Aziri had dismissed it as the usual military gossip, the kind that circulated in any hierarchical institution where power was concentrated in the hands of a few. Until 3 senior Ivian officers had cornered her after learning of her assignment to train with the other species. Their eyes had been serious, their voices low, their body language tense with remembered discomfort. "He favors females with notable physical features," one had told her, her own fangs slightly more prominent than Aziri's. "Especially battle scars. He keeps trophies in his own way." "He'll find reasons to get you alone," another had added, unconsciously rubbing at her wrist where a faint scar still lingered. "Uniform violations, additional training sessions, performance reviews, and when you're alone..." The third, who had served under him for 2 rotations, had gripped Aziri's shoulder with urgency, her claws leaving indentations in Aziri's uniform. "When he try to touch you, and he will try, document everything. Not that it will matter. The Council gives generals full autonomy. There are no official channels for complaints." Aziri had nodded, making mental notes of their warnings, but hadn't truly understood the seriousness of their concern until this moment. Staring at the human female beside her, who embodied every preference the general supposedly had. Aziri's 4-chambered heart quickened its pace as she realized the danger the human might be in. Her gaze lingered on Emma's profile, taking in the scar that dominated the left side of her face. It wasn't a clean, surgical line, but jagged and complex, speaking of violence survived. The kind of mark that told a story, exactly the kind of story General Drozir supposedly collected. Should she warn her? The human was a stranger, a member of a species still relatively new to the Galactic Council. They had no bonds of shared culture or experience, Protocols strictly forbade unnecessary communication before inspection. Breaking that rule could result in disciplinary action before her training had even properly begun. But if the veterans' warnings were accurate, if the general truly was as predatory as they claimed, Aziri only needed a few seconds to decide. Some kind of sisterhood code must certainly apply across species. The urge to protect, to warn of danger, surely transcended the differences of biology and culture. At least, that was what she wanted to believe. Aziri glanced at the chronometer on the far wall. The drill sergeants would arrive in approximately 5 minutes, followed by the general himself. The rigid protocol would begin, and any unauthorized communication would be punished with swift authority. It was now or never. She surveyed the row of females on either side of her, weighing the risk of being observed. To her left stood 3 chrysalians, their transparent skin revealing the complex network of organs beneath. Hearts pumping greenish fluid, central nervous systems pulsing with electrical signals, digestive systems processing the morning nutrition. Beyond them, a cluster of Maraxians, with their signature blue scales and dorsal ridges that rose and fell with their breathing. To her right, past the human, were 2 furred Tellurians, and a single Zaan, whose exoskeleton refracted the light into tiny rainbows on the floor. Across the vast hall, the male cadets stood in their own formation, nearly identical in posture if vastly different in physiology. Most species displayed subtle dimorphism, though some, like the Zaan, were virtually indistinguishable by human or Ivian standards. The males seemed equally tense, their postures rigid as they awaited inspection, though Aziri knew from the veterans' warnings that they had far less to fear from General Droze's personal attention. "Human," she whispered, barely moving her lips, modulating her voice to be audible only to her immediate neighbor. "Do you know anything about General Droze?" Emma's eyes moved toward her, an unreadable expression crossing her scarred face. For a moment, Aziri wondered if she'd made a mistake. Perhaps humans didn't understand discreet communication, or maybe this one didn't speak the common galactic tongue fluently enough to grasp the question. "Who are you?" Emma finally whispered back, her voice so low it was barely audible over the ambient noise of the facility's life support systems. "And why are you bringing up the general?" Aziri swallowed, suddenly aware of how this might appear. Unauthorized conversation about a superior officer could be interpreted as insubordination, or worse, conspiracy. The penalties for either could be severe, especially for new cadets trying to establish their place in the rigid hierarchy of the galactic military. "I'm Cadet Aziri, 3rd Battalion," she replied, keeping her gaze forward, her mouth barely moving. "Ivian." "Emma, 2nd Battalion, human, obviously." Emma's lips barely moved, but Aziri detected a slight softening in her posture, a fractional relaxation that suggested she wasn't offended by the interruption. "So, why the interest in Drozier?" Aziri hesitated. How to explain this without sounding inappropriate herself, without coming across as spreading malicious gossip about a superior officer? She chose her words with careful precision. "Among Ivian females, we share information about certain types of males," she whispered. "It's a cultural practice for safety, a tradition." She didn't specify exactly which type of males she meant, believing that was enough for any female to understand, regardless of species. A beat of silence passed between them, stretching into several seconds, and Aziri wondered if the human would believe her, take her seriously, or even appreciate the information. Perhaps humans had different cultural norms around such warnings. Perhaps they didn't engage in the same protective information sharing that Ivian females had practiced for generations. "And Drozier is one of those types?" Emma asked finally, her voice neutral but her posture tensing slightly. A subtle shift that Aziri might not have noticed if she hadn't been so attuned to the human's reactions. "Yes," Aziri confirmed, feeling a surge of relief that Emma seemed to understand the implication. "I thought you should know." Emma turned her head slightly, just enough to meet Aziri's gaze without breaking formation. To Aziri's surprise, she didn't ask for proof or question how she knew this information. She didn't dismiss the warning or become defensive. "How bad is it?" Emma asked simply, her directness catching Aziri off guard. Aziri felt a small wave of relief wash through her. At least the human wasn't dismissing her outright. "I'm not sure about how he is with humans specifically, but your species has features he's known to like." Emma raised an eyebrow slightly, encouraging Aziri to continue without actually speaking. "We're similar in basic form," Aziri continued, choosing each word carefully to avoid being overheard by the Chrysalians to her left, whose auditory capabilities were renowned. "And that scar on your face?" She paused, searching for the right words. "My sisters-in-arms warned all Ivian cadets about his preferences. He has a fascination with battle scars, especially facial ones. He becomes insufferable, ignores boundaries when he takes an interest." Emma was silent for so long that Aziri began to worry she'd offended her somehow. Maybe humans didn't speak of such things. Maybe their military culture was different. Perhaps they had protections in their ranks that Ivians lacked. Just as she was about to apologize, Emma spoke. "Thank you for the warning," she said. "Who can we report to if he's improper?" Aziri felt a jolt of panic surge through her system, her inner eyelids fluttering rapidly in distress. What was this human thinking? "Report to?" she whispered urgently. "You don't understand. Generals of the Galactic Council answer to no one except the Parliament itself, and even then, they have full autonomy in their command decisions." "There must be someone," Emma insisted, a frown creasing her forehead. "Even generals have to follow regulations." "Not these ones," Aziri hissed, more forcefully than intended, causing a Meraxian several positions down to glance in their direction. She waited until the blue-scaled cadet looked away before continuing in an even lower whisper. "Not here. The best protection is prevention. Cover your scar with your hair. Humans are new enough to the Council that there's no established protocol about loose hair yet. Make yourself less noticeable." Emma appeared to consider this, her expression thoughtful. Aziri could almost see the calculations happening behind her eyes, weighing options, considering strategies, evaluating risks. The human's face was remarkably expressive, at least to Aziri's eyes, trained as she was to read her own species' more subtle cues. "Thank you for the warning, Aziri," she said finally, her voice soft but with an undercurrent of steel that Aziri found at the same time reassuring and concerning. "But I won't be hiding anything. I have other ways to defend myself if the General tries anything inappropriate." Aziri couldn't help the small scoff that escaped her, a sound that conveyed disbelief in any language. "Do whatever you want," she replied, her tone making it clear she thought the human was being foolish. Some people only learned the hard way, she supposed. At least she had tried. The massive doors at the end of the hall slid open at once, the hissing sound cutting through the low murmur of the assembled cadets like a knife. Instantly, the room fell into absolute silence, as if a switch had been flipped. The drill officers entered first, 20 of them, representing various species, their uniforms crisp and identical despite their vastly different physiologies. They marched in perfect synchronization, their footsteps creating a rhythmic pattern on the solid floor as they took positions around the perimeter of the room. But it was the figure who entered last that commanded every cadet's attention. General Drozir towered over even the tallest of the drill officers. his height emphasizing the authority his rank already granted him. His green skin, tight across bulging muscles, seemed to absorb the light more than it reflected it, a characteristic of the Zodar species that had evolved on a world where camouflage was important. The rarity of his kind in the current galaxy only added to his imposing presence. Aziri had heard that fewer than 100 Zodars held positions in the galactic military, and only one had achieved the rank of general. His uniform, unlike the standard issue worn by everyone else in the room, was tailored specifically for him, emphasizing his powerful build. Medals and commendations adorned his chest, speaking of battles fought and won, of decisions made that had altered the course of interstellar conflicts. His boots, polished to a mirror shine, added another few centimeters to his already considerable height. The general's footsteps echoed as he strode to the center of the hall, the sound seeming to reverberate through Aziri's very bones. His 4 eyes, 2 primary and 2 smaller secondary ones above them, scanned the room intensely, missing nothing. Aziri felt her skin prickle with instinctive unease, a primitive response to a perceived predator that her years of education and training couldn't entirely suppress. Beside her, she could sense Emma's attention sharpening, though the human maintained her perfect posture. General Drozi raised one massive hand, gesturing to the drill officers to remain where they were. "I will inspect this batch personally," he announced, his voice surprisingly smooth for a being of his size, the large hall carrying the sound to every corner without apparent effort. Aziri's heart sank as she noticed him not even glancing toward the male side of the hall. Instead, his gaze swept across the female cadets, lingering on the front row. Her row. Emma's row. He began his inspection with methodical speed, starting at the far end of the first female row. He stopped in front of a Saurian cadet, her lizard-like features impassive despite the general's scrutiny. He examined her scaled skin, the ridge of spines along her back, the powerful tail that regulation required to be tightly wrapped around her waist while in formation. "Rough skin," he commented dismissively, before moving on. Next was a female chrysalian, her internal organs visible through her transparent epidermis, a feature that most species found either fascinating or disturbing. The general barely looked at her, his disinterest evident in his posture. "Too weird," he muttered, already turning away. He continued down the line, pausing before a third species with an impressive mane that Aziri couldn't identify from her limited xenobiology studies. The general's nostrils flared as he leaned in closer, and the cadet visibly stiffened. "Too smelly," he declared, waving a hand in front of her face as if to dispel an unpleasant odor. Each assessment was quick, clinical, and often derogatory, a single pronouncement before he moved on. Some cadets received comments about their height, others about their build, others still about features specific to their species. None of the remarks were particularly professional or constructive, but none were overtly inappropriate either. At least, not by the loose standards applied to those of his rank. As the general worked his way closer to her position, Aziri's anxiety mounted, her inner eyelids flickering more rapidly in response to her stress. She had taken precautions, knowing this day would come. Her hair, normally kept in a style that accentuated the elegant shape of her skull, was unwashed, lying flat and dull against her head. She had applied a plant-based powder to her skin that diminished its natural sheen, making it appear duller and slightly flaky in a way that suggested poor health or improper grooming by Ivian standards. She had even foregone her usual dental routine that morning, hoping a less-than-fresh breath might deter any close interaction. These small acts of self-sabotage were her armor, her way of making herself less appealing to the general's known preferences. They provided a thin layer of comfort as the intimidating figure moved inexorably closer. But what about the human beside her? Despite refusing to cover her scar, Emma seemed to be paying close attention to the general's behavior. Aziri noticed her stealing glances at him, observing his interactions with the other females with an intensity that suggested she was cataloguing information for future reference. Perhaps she had seen reason and realized her mistake. Aziri could only hope. The general stopped in front of the Zaan cadet to Aziri's right, his massive form casting a shadow over the crystalline being. He rumbled, reaching out to tap the Zaan's exoskeleton with one finger, producing a clear ringing sound like crystal struck with metal. Interesting texture, but too brittle looking. And then, finally, inevitably, he stood before Aziri. She kept her gaze forward, not meeting any of his 4 eyes, as protocol demanded. Her hearts thundered in her chest, their beating irregular with stress. She could smell him now, a musky, mineral scent that reminded her of the volcanic regions of her homeworld. Not unpleasant, precisely, but alien and intimidating in its unfamiliarity. The general took longer with her than with the others, his gaze scanning her from head to toe in a way that felt invasive despite its silence. He reached out with one thick finger, touching one of her protruding fangs without permission, a violation of Ivian cultural taboos that under any other circumstances it would have justified immediate and violent response. The contact sent a wave of revulsion through Aziri, a visceral reaction she struggled to contain beneath her mask of military discipline. Her fang was being casually invaded by this stranger. She wanted nothing more than to rush to the hygiene facilities and brush her teeth until the sensation of his touch was gone, to scrub away the touch along with the physical imprint. But she remained still, her face a mask of military discipline, betraying nothing of her inner turmoil. The general's gaze continued its journey, lingering on her form in a way that made her wish for additional layers of clothing, despite the perfectly adequate coverage of her uniform. "A bit better," he finally said, "but too sloppy and boring." Relief flooded through Aziri, a sensation so powerful that her knees almost buckled beneath her. Sloppy and boring were exactly what she had aimed for. Her small deceptions had worked. She was safe. For now. The general moved on to stand directly in front of Emma. Aziri, slightly turned to maintain her perfect alignment in the formation, could see the moment his interest sharpened. His primary eyes widened slightly, pupils dilating, and his secondary pair focused with laser intensity on the scar that carved its way across Emma's face. A subtle change came over his posture, a straightening of his spine, a slight leaning forward, a tensing of muscles beneath his uniform that spoke of sudden, intense interest. Without hesitation, without asking permission, he reached out and traced the length of the scar with one green finger, from temple to jaw, following its jagged path across Emma's otherwise smooth skin. "Fascinating," he murmured, breaking his pattern of single-word assessments. "How did you acquire this?" Emma didn't flinch at the uninvited touch, though Aziri saw her pupils contract slightly, the only visible sign of her reaction. "Combat training accident, sir," she answered, her voice steady and professional, giving nothing away. The general's massive nostrils flared as he inhaled deeply, seeming to savor her scent in a way that made Aziri's skin crawl with discomfort. Again, Emma showed no reaction, maintaining her perfect posture and forward gaze as if this was all perfectly standard protocol. Then, breaking the pattern he had established with all other cadets, General Drozir circled around her, examining her from behind. The movement was reminiscent of a predator circling wounded prey, evaluating the best angle of attack. Aziri, from her position, could see hints of discomfort finally registering on Emma's face, a slight tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible tension in her jaw. Still, the human maintained her composure, not turning to follow the general's movement as he disappeared from her field of vision. I find a violation in your uniform, human cadet, Drozir announced, drawing every eye in the room to Emma's perfectly standard issue attire. You will report to my office after this assembly for correction. Aziri's heart sank, a cold feeling of dread spreading through her body. This was exactly what her Ivian sisters had warned about. The general finding excuses to get female cadets alone. She glanced at Emma, expecting to see fear or at least concern, but the human's expression remained neutral, almost detached, as if she were observing the situation from a great distance. "I respectfully decline, sir," Emma replied, her voice clear and unwavering, each word precisely enunciated to ensure it carried to everyone in the hall. The words spread through the air like a physical presence, an anomaly so unexpected that it seemed to distort the very atmosphere in the room. Aziri couldn't believe what she had just heard. Around her, other cadets shifted minutely, their shock evident despite their training. No one refused a direct order from a general, especially not a cadet on their first day of training. It was unthinkable, a breach of protocol so severe that Aziri couldn't even imagine what the consequences might be. General Drozir, still standing behind Emma, seemed equally perplexed by her response. For several heartbeats, he said nothing, as if giving her the opportunity to retract her words, to claim they had been a momentary lapse in judgment that she now regretted. When she didn't, his voice lowered to a dangerous rumble, like the warning growl of a large predator. "You think you have a choice, cadet?" And then it happened. The general's hand moved in a blur, coming down hard against Emma's posterior, with a slap that echoed through the entire hall like a gunshot. The sound seemed to reverberate off the walls, hanging in the air for what felt like an eternity. The next moment unfolded in fragments of time that Aziri's mind struggled to process, like images captured by a malfunctioning recording device. Emma became a blur of motion, a twist, a pivot, a flash of hands moving at once, and with devastating speed. There was a sickening crack that made Aziri's own bones ache in sympathy, a sound so visceral and immediate that several cadets flinched visibly. And then stillness. Horrible, tense stillness that seemed to stretch into infinity. The general's wrist was bent at an angle nature never intended, clearly broken. His 4 eyes were wide with shock and the beginning of pain, his mouth open in an expression of disbelief. Emma stood perfectly still, her posture unchanged except for the slight adjustment of her stance, her expression calm and focused. The silence in the hall was absolute. Not a breath, not a movement, not a whisper disturbed the frozen tableau of violence and its aftermath. Then the general roared, a sound of pure rage and agony that rattled Aziri's teeth and sent vibrations through the floor beneath her feet. His uninjured hand swung toward Emma's head with enough force to shatter bone, a blow fueled by pain and humiliation and the instinctive lashing out of a wounded apex predator. Aziri moved without thinking. Years of training on her homeworld, before ever joining the galactic forces, took over. She lunged forward, seizing Emma by the arm and yanking her away from the general's strike. The momentum carried them both several steps back, just beyond his reach, their boots squeaking against the polished floor as they found their balance. The general's fist connected with nothing but air, the force of his missed blow making him stumble forward. He tried to catch himself with his injured hand, putting pressure on his broken wrist. He howled again, this time with undisguised pain, the sound echoing off the high ceiling and reverberating through the stunned silence of the hall. "Why did you do that?" Emma whispered, her eyes wide as she stared at Aziri, genuine surprise breaking through her composed exterior for the first time. Aziri wasn't entirely sure herself. She had acted on instinct, to protect this human she barely knew from being injured, yes, but also to prevent her from causing further harm to the general. A broken wrist was assault. A more serious injury could have been grounds for execution under galactic law. The notion of this strange human being put to death over a moment of justified self-defense had triggered something protective in Aziri, a reflex she hadn't known she possessed. Before she could formulate a response, the general's voice boomed across the hall, strained with pain but no less authoritative. "Arrest them both," he commanded, clutching his injured wrist to his chest, his green skin paling to a sickly hue around the injury. "Now!" The drill officers moved immediately, surrounding Aziri and Emma in a tight circle of varying species and capabilities, but unified in their purpose. Some held weapons, though none were aimed directly at them yet, a small mercy that Aziri noted with grim appreciation.
"You will both accompany us to the detention center,"
one officer, a tall, willowy being with 4 arms and skin the color of burnished copper, stated.
"Your respective species' representatives will be notified of this incident. You will have much to explain."
Aziri felt the weight of every eye in the hull upon them as they were surrounded by the officers. The cadets stared, some with shock, others with something that might have been respect. The drill officers' expressions were harder to read across the various species, but those she could interpret seemed to hold little sympathy for the general's order, though they followed it nonetheless. As they were escorted from the hall, Aziri's mind raced with regret and uncertainty. Why had she gotten involved? She had potentially ruined her military career before it had even begun, all for a human she barely knew. Her family would be devastated when they learned of this. Their hopes for her advancement in the galactic forces and the benefits it would bring to their community were now in jeopardy, all because she had acted on instinct, without thought for the consequences. "Thank you," Emma said quietly as they were marched through the sterile corridors of the training facility, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. "For pulling me away from him. That was unexpected." Aziri glanced at her. The human didn't seem frightened or even particularly concerned about their situation. There was a calmness to her demeanor that Aziri found both reassuring and infuriating. "It better be worth it," she replied, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "We're both in serious trouble now." Emma's lips curved into a slight smile, an expression so out of place in their current circumstances that Aziri wondered if humans processed danger differently than Ivians. "It'll be okay," she said with a confidence Aziri couldn't understand. "You'll see." Aziri didn't share her optimism. As the detention center's doors loomed ahead, she could only wonder what consequences awaited them, and whether this strange human certainty was justified or merely naive. The doors slid open, revealing a sterile, white room with 2 chairs bolted to the floor. The officers directed them inside, with gestures that left no room for argument.
"Wait here,"
the 4-armed officer instructed.
"Representatives are being contacted now."
The doors closed with a final sounding thud, leaving Emma and Aziri alone with their uncertain future. 2 hours had passed in the sterile detention center. Aziri sat rigidly in her chair, inner eyelids fluttering with anxiety as she reconsidered every life choice that had led her to this moment. Across from her, Emma looked almost relaxed, occasionally stretching her limbs as if this were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "How can you be so calm?" Aziri finally burst out, her frustration boiling over. "You broke a general's wrist. Do you understand what that means? He could have you executed." Emma merely shrugged, leaning back in her chair. "Trust me, I'll be fine. No one will even remember you helped me later. Your career won't suffer." "That's what you're worried about? My career?" Aziri's fangs clicked together in agitation. "I don't understand you at all. This isn't some minor infraction. This is assault against a high-ranking Galactic Council officer." "Things aren't always what they seem," Emma replied cryptically, that same infuriating smile playing at her lips. Aziri rose to her feet, pink skin flushing darker with anger. "What does that even mean? Stop speaking in riddles. We're both facing serious consequences, and you're acting like this is all a game." Emma's expression softened. I'm sorry you got caught up in this. I appreciate what you did, but I promise it's gonna work out better than you expect." Before Aziri could respond, the cell door slid open. Two figures entered, one human male in a crisp diplomatic uniform, adorned with Earth insignia, and an Ivian female in the traditional robes of an interspecies representative. Aziri immediately recognized her species' ambassador, Emir Kavesh, a distant relative from her mother's lineage. "Ambassador Wayne," Emma acknowledged with a nod to the human. "Cadet Lopez," the human responded, though something in his tone suggested the title was merely a formality. "I see you've been making friends." Ambassador Emir's attention focused entirely on Aziri.
Cadet, your family will be relieved to hear you're unharmed.
"I don't understand," Aziri said, looking between the two representatives. "We were to await disciplinary proceedings." The human ambassador chuckled. "That won't be necessary. You're both free to go." "What?" Aziri's inner eyelids flickered rapidly in confusion. "But the general is being treated for a minor injury and has more pressing concerns," Ambassador Wayne said smoothly. "We'll be departing within the hour." "Departing?" Aziri repeated, feeling as though she'd missed several crucial parts of the conversation. Emma stood, straightening her uniform. "Perhaps I should explain. Humanity's joining the Galactic Council's military was always an exploratory arrangement. I'm not actually a cadet, Aziri. I'm Captain Emma Lopez of Earth Special Forces." "A spy?" Aziri whispered, horrified. "More like an observer," Emma corrected. "Several of us were sent to different facilities to assess whether the Galactic Army would be suitable for human recruits, who can be challenging to integrate. Let's keep it at that. Today's incident confirmed our worst suspicions. This environment isn't appropriate for humans." Ambassador Wayne nodded. "The power imbalances, the lack of accountability for leadership, we can't accept that." "But what about me?" Aziri asked, panic rising. "Will I be left to take the blame once you're gone?" The human ambassador laughed. "Absolutely not. We've arranged everything. As far as official records are concerned, there was a mass incident involving all human cadets after what happened to Captain Lopez. No one will even remember your involvement once they hear about all the destruction the other humans supposedly did." Emma stepped forward, extending her hand in what Aziri recognized as a human greeting gesture. "Thank you again for the warning, and for pulling me away from him. You didn't have to do either." Aziri tentatively accepted the handshake, still struggling to process this sudden reversal of fortune. "Come, Captain Lopez," Ambassador Wayne said, checking his communication device. "The others are waiting. Extraction begins in 20 minutes. Emma nodded, then paused at the doorway. She turned back to Aziri, her scarred face softening into a genuine smile. "For what it's worth, you were the only one who warned me. Out of all the cadets and officers here, you were the only one who showed real courage." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small metallic disc with an Earth insignia. "If you ever need to contact me." She tossed it to Aziri, who caught it reflexively. Ambassador Wayne cleared his throat impatiently. "The general has been contained, but there's quite a commotion in the main hall. The other human cadets have apparently started what your people might call a mutiny." From somewhere in the distance, Aziri could hear shouting, the crash of equipment being overturned, and what sounded unsettlingly like cheering. "That would be the other humans," Emma said with a wry smile. "They have a flair for the dramatic." As they stepped into the corridor, Aziri caught a glimpse of several security officers rushing past, weapons drawn. None of them spared a glance for the detention cell or its occupants. "See?" Emma called back over her shoulder. "They've already forgotten about you." Aziri watched as Emma and Ambassador Wayne continued down the corridor, their figures growing smaller with distance. Emma's confident stride, so different from the careful posture of most military personnel, marked her as something other than a typical cadet even from behind. At an intersection, Emma paused, turning back one last time. She offered a quick, two-fingered salute that seemed more personal than official, then disappeared around the corner with the human ambassador. Emir placed a gentle hand on Aziri's shoulder when they were alone.
Under normal circumstances, interfering with a general's discipline would have serious consequences,
the ambassador said once they were alone.
But you may have created an unexpected opening for diplomatic relations with humanity.
What does that mean? Aziri asked.
It means you'll likely not only avoid punishment, but may receive commendation. The humans are impressed by your willingness to stand up for one of their own, even at personal risk.
Emir's expression turned thoughtful.
They're a curious species, powerful, technologically self-sufficient, and extremely protective of their people. Having them view you favorably could prove valuable.
Aziri struggled to comprehend this sudden shift in her fortunes. Will I see her again? Captain Lopez, I mean? I'd like to have a proper conversation, now that I know who she really is. Ambassador Emir smiled, her fangs gleaming in the bright lights of the detention cell.
I think that's very likely, Cadet. Very likely indeed.